Learning to move. It's a skill that can change everything.
You know, we're sending people to the moon, and meanwhile we have push into my hands as the main evaluation tool for joint and muscle injuries, which is incredible. With all these advances we've made in technology, we somehow forgot to address what is the most common occurrence, which is musculoskeletal injuries.
That's Dr. Phil Wagner, the founder and CEO of Sparta Science, a lab that is attempting to take instincts and trained movement to elevate the best athletes on Earth and the moon. I'm Bram Weinstein. This is the FUTRSPRT Podcast. Phil Wagner was an athlete himself, and it was his injuries that derailed his career, so he decided to do something about it. Billionaire in the sports tech space might be someone who can come up with preventing injuries to star players. It's probably an impossibility, but it is a mission of Dr. Phil Wagner, who is the founder, CEO of Sparta Science, and he is our guest this week. Hi, Phil. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Bram.
So what got you into the idea of injury prevention?
You know, I think the frustration was originally born out of these injuries that I sustained as an athlete in different areas, and kind of was shocked by the level of randomness that was occurring, during that process. And so as a result, wanted to go into coaching to figure out, how I could help others avoid that issue, only to find that my issue was more of a shared phenomenon. And so that's where going to medical school and eventually starting a technology company, looking to solve this problem of how do we address injury risk, and if injuries are sustained, how do we rehabilitate that individual?
So let's go back to your life as an athlete, a football and a rugby player. What happened? What were the avoidable injuries that occurred to you?
I'm laughing because what didn't happen would be the better question. I think, had muscle injuries in different areas, which certainly are preventable. It becomes more difficult once you sustain the first one. It's more likely to have the others. But concussions became a problem, ended up having a few shoulder surgeries, and so really kind of the whole gamut.
And let me go back to the idea that you put out there of there was randomness in how it was treated. Can you give some examples of what you experienced that you were trying to get a better solution to?
Yeah, and I think, probably the best high-level point to bring up is that we're sending people to the moon, and meanwhile we have push into my hands as the main evaluation tool for joint and muscle injuries, which is incredible. With all these advances we've made in technology, we somehow forgot to address what is the most common occurrence, which is musculoskeletal injuries. And so as a result, my experience and many people's experience is you really are at the whim of the opinions of the practitioner. How good are they at pushing into your hands? So that's what makes it challenging.
What's strange to hear it is that in the case of high-level professional athletes, and there's a major investment in their health, and it will have a lot to do with the success of the team as a whole, that there would be any level of randomness allowed to even percolate in that atmosphere.
Yeah, I think we've been compared before to the second Moneyball, and the same idea, right, of, it was amazing 20 years ago that salaries were paid without a lot of heavy analytics into the sport performance. It's very similar in that today, players are invested in, whether it's straight out of the draft or additional contracts, without any objective information as to their health and injury risk. And really, it goes across the population, not just in sports, but one of the value points that we we see now in the landscape of things is now machine learning has allowed the ability to evaluate, mass data and really help some of these practitioners, leverage, the community as a whole.
You did have the opportunity to work overseas as well. Were the problems the same in Australia and New Zealand and that part of the world as you are seeing with United States athletes?
Yeah, it's a good question. When I saw their sports science for the first time, they explained to me that, basically they had a smaller population. They didn't have the ability, as they explained to me, to break a few eggs. They look at the U.S. model as like, if we break a few eggs along the way, we can afford that because we've got, 20 other Olympians behind that person. Whereas overseas, if Australia, for example, loses or their number one sprinter gets hurt, they'll probably have to wait 12 more years for the next great sprinter to come around in that country. And so because the population is so much larger, we haven't had really the need to develop the kind of efficiency that other countries have. That being said, I think there's a great level of coaching and communication in the United States, but overseas they're certainly more comfortable with health technology.
I can only imagine a couple of U.S. athletes who didn't quite get to that spot that they thought they would based on injury, listening to you say a couple of eggs got broken along the way and wondering, was that me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of those eggs. And I think that desire to compete, that desire to be on a team, it still hurts. And I think that's what drives, I think, the mission that we're doing at Sparta, and certainly drives a lot of the technology that's being built to evaluate where somebody's at in their journey of being an athlete.
So what is the mission of Sparta Science?
Yeah, we believe there should be no physical limitations to movement. And, that's a pretty lofty goal and a pretty lofty vision, but, the really only thing that should be holding you back is your will, your conviction that you want to do something. That should be your only obstacle in terms of overcoming injuries and being healthy as you play your sport.
So practically, what does that mean? Can you kind of describe what are some of the ways that you work with athletes outside of you have to have the will to do this?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the major frameworks that we look at is how an individual interacts with the ground. Because unless they're a water polo player, everybody has some sort of interaction with the ground, even swimmers, coming off the blocks, in the turns. And so how do we evaluate that interaction with the ground, and how do we classify that for individuals that are at risk or individuals that, might be coming through rehab, and how do we know when to progress them? And we've used and continue to use a tool called a force plate that really gathers about 1,000 points a second in 3 different directions. And how does that force plate evaluate that ground interaction and provide a signal that can be used for insights into what that athlete needs to be doing differently?
So are you, maybe I just need it more in layman's terms, are you explaining to people how to run, how to literally swim?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We actually look more at the general movement pattern, whether that be a simple jump upwards, a vertical jump, or a balance assessment, or a plank. So some of these more primal or general movements, because what we don't want to get in the process of is just evaluating the skill, because that's something separate. Just because, I can produce a lot of force, hitting a baseball doesn't mean I can actually hit a 90-mile-an-hour fastball, as an example. And so we want to evaluate the system physically, so when that individual does start doing their skills in their sport, there's no physical limitations, and it's really just the repetitions to hone that skill of the sport.
And I would imagine that you have to be careful with instincts. I mean, that a number of the reasons why these people reached these peaks is they have natural instincts to do this, right?
100%. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is this natural selection, but it's less so of a natural selection physically. It's a natural selection of these individuals probably have great instincts of when to push through pain and when not to. Or they just happen to be nearby good practitioners.
So, can you talk about some of the partnerships you have with teams and what you're working on with them?
Yeah, we started in college basketball, so it was, pretty exciting for us. 11 of our partners were universities teams that were in the recent March Madness tournament, including Auburn. And so, that was great to kind of see this growth within college basketball where it all began. Beyond that, the other transition exciting piece for us is as Major League Baseball is getting going, having a few teams starting to use it. Our first client was actually the Colorado Rockies. And so been great to see them over the last 4 years really grow into a more successful winning team. And then we also work with special forces in the military and even the NFL. We're a test that's used at the NFL Combine, which is a great opportunity to identify risk for players and help them really identify what's going to be the best ways to prolong their career.
Can you describe the test? What do you guys do at the Combine?
So we do a jump test there, vertical jump straight upwards. We do a balance test on one leg. So we look at how well you can stabilize on one leg versus the other. And then we look at a plank test on one arm. So we look at how well your core on one side stabilizes relative to your core musculature on the other side.
And what do you do with that information? How do you then translate it back to the team or the athlete, if you're working with a specific athlete, of how to improve and how to get around potential injury?
Yeah, we give it a percentile of where that individual lies compared to their peers. And from that, that context allows the individual to decide, okay, how much is too much? And where are my weaknesses? A good example is, offensive linemen on a jump tend to really do well on that initial force generation, which makes sense because if you play offensive line, when you get down into your stance, hopefully for your quarterback, you're able to initiate force well, and so that's great to see reflected in the jump. But the challenge is once you exceed a certain percentile of that initial force, that puts you at risk for an ACL injury, which is very common in linemen. So this whole concept of Icarus and how do we help athletes perform at the highest level, yet still remain healthy, is a real key to the database. We're basically trying to fly as close to the sun as possible without getting burned.
Yeah. And have you gotten burned yet?
Well, I think one of the confusing pieces when it comes to prediction is a lot of times, coaches and sports people think very black and white. So when they hear prediction, they confuse that with guarantee. And so the prediction really is, it's like blackjack or the weather. You're assigning odds to occurrences that could happen. And we initially were wrong quite a bit, and the goal is that right now, each year, we become more accurate with our predictions because we have more data. Right now, our injury prediction tool is about the equivalent of a mammogram in terms of detecting breast cancer. So it continues to improve, and hopefully we continue to be more accurate with some of these predictions that we're seeing.
Maybe you could share then some surprises that have come out over the years here in going through this data because you're studying the human body and no one's figured it out yet. We're still working on that. So what are some of the conclusions you've come to that you were actually surprised by?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces behind machine learning is it allows you to come to conclusions that, you would never think possible. And a good example is with baseball, we were able to see that when individuals don't initiate force well on a vertical jump, they have an increased odds for an elbow injury, Tommy John. And when we think about that, we would have never looked for that. But then once the database is able to identify that, we can start thinking, oh, well, that makes sense, because if you don't start or initiate force well with your lower body, then you're going to have to use your upper body to generate that force. After all, there's a giant pitching rubber on the mound for a reason, right? It's encouraging you to use your legs. So that was a big surprise. I think the other surprises have been we're able to identify some concussion risk from the plank test. And we started to think, wow, that's I thought it would be more from the balance test. Why the plank? And then when you think about it, that starts to make sense as well, because a lot of the concussions, they're not happening necessarily in big NFL players. A lot of times they're happening in youth athletes, particularly girls soccer. And one of the reasons is the neck strength is so much more diminished relative to their peers, and they can't control their head position. So as a result, the head into the ball or the head into the ground, that really starts to explain why we find some of these surprises.
Obviously, nothing is absolute, especially when we're talking about athletes going at the speed that they go and crashing into one another. Yep. But do you see a pathway to a reduction in the concussion issue for sports like football or soccer?
I do. We're a big believer in the body as a system, so it's not far-fetched to say that if you move better with your lower body, you can reduce concussion risk because you're going to be in better positions, whether it's contact like football or whether it's going up for a header like in soccer. If you have better overall body control, if your system is more efficient, we believe that we can reduce that concussion risk. That's one way. I think another way to start reducing these concussions is if the individual is cleared, they can go back into their sport and have a much lower risk for subsequent concussion. Most people don't know this, but the gold standard for concussion return to play when it comes to the physical side, not the cognitive side, but the physical side, is they have someone stand there with a pen and paper and they mark down how many times you touch your foot to the ground while you balance for 20 seconds. And that is not high school. That is for the NFL, the NBA, professional leagues. That is what we're using to evaluate somebody's ability to return to play.
Concussions obviously are a huge issue that the leagues have to deal with. The arm issues that you named in baseball, specifically the devastating ones like Tommy John, are obviously a huge issue. Is there something out there, a commonplace injury that is occurring that you guys are earmarking and saying we'd like to find a solution to try to limit those?
Yeah, I think that the big one that continues to rise is ACL. Certainly concussions in the media quite a bit and has pretty long-term severe consequences. But, we haven't even really touched ACL in terms of the occurrences. It continues to rise. We learn more, but we actually don't necessarily affect the outcome. So we're really focused on actually pairing up the interventions with ACL to reduce the occurrences. A good example in females is, 20 years ago they said, their females have more ACLs because they have wider hips. And then 10 years later, they said, no, wait a minute, it's because they have hamstrings. Their hamstrings are weaker than males. And then about 5 years ago, they said, well, it's actually trunk position, in that they're not as strong in the upper body, they can't control their trunk and put stress on the knee. And the real answer is all of the above, in that every individual is going to have a unique pattern. And so how do we identify that individual's risk, whether it's hamstring, hips, trunk, and put in the appropriate plan to reduce that risk?
I'll leave you with this because you had mentioned youth sports. Professional teams can pay for your services. Collegiate programs can do the same. For youth sports, what is your best advice to coaches, leagues, young athletes about injury prevention?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have kids of my own, so I see it now. The specialization is a huge cause for what we see. And in terms of the injury spikes with youth sports, really a lot of youth, they lack this movement portfolio, for lack of a better word. They're only able to do a small number of movements really well. So when they are exposed to the randomness that sometimes occurs in sports, their body isn't robust enough to be able to respond to those challenges. And so, really exposing individuals to different movement patterns, whether that's playing different sports or different games, or even training, as a cross-training tool very differently, are something I think every parent and child needs to really engage with to maximize their resilience.
Dr. Phil Wagner is the founder and CEO of Sparta Science. Thank you for joining us, Phil.
Thank you, Bram.